Millionaire Ignores Poor Stranger. Years later, that stranger saves his life. What if the person you ignored when they needed help the most ended up being the one to save your life? This is the incredible story of a millionaire who once dismissed a struggling stranger, only to find himself at the mercy of that same man years later. The twist? It's not what you'd expect. Watch until the end to see how fate played a shocking role in this unbelievable, true-to-life tale. The city buzzed with life as people rushed through the streets, lost in their own worlds. Chicago's skyline stretched high above, its towering buildings casting long shadows over the busy sidewalks below. The air was crisp with the bite of late autumn, and golden leaves swirled in the wind, collecting at the feet of street vendors and hurried commuters. Among the countless figures moving through the concrete jungle, one man stood apart, not by choice but by circumstance. Daniel sat hunched against a cold brick wall, a worn-out backpack beside him, holding everything he owned. His clothes were layered but still inadequate against the chill, his fingers stiff as they clutched a canvas, a painting he had poured his heart into. It was his last piece, his final attempt to make something of himself before giving up entirely. He had once dreamed of art galleries and exhibitions, of wealthy collectors admiring his work. But reality had been cruel. With no connections, no stable job, and no support, he had been forced onto the streets, relying on the rare kindness of strangers just to survive. Yet, even now, his spirit wasn't entirely broken. There was still a spark of hope, a sliver of belief that maybe, just maybe, someone would see his talent and give him a chance. And so, when he spotted a well-dressed man stepping out of a sleek black Mercedes, Daniel seized the moment. The man's tailored Armani suit and polished Italian shoes screamed wealth and success. If anyone could afford his painting, it was him. Summoning his courage, Daniel stepped forward, extending the canvas with shaking hands. "Sir, would you like to buy a painting?" he asked, his voice laced with both hope and desperation. The man, Michael Thornton, barely slowed his stride. He glanced at Daniel, then at the painting, and scoffed. "I don't waste my money on garbage," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. And just like that, he was gone, slipping into his luxury car and driving away, leaving Daniel standing there, his hope crumbling like the dry leaves at his feet. Michael Thornton had once believed he was untouchable, a self-made millionaire. He had climbed the ladder of success with sheer determination, clever investments, and, if he were honest, a ruthless disregard for those beneath him. His real estate empire stretched across multiple cities. His name was synonymous with power, and his calendar was filled with exclusive events where only the wealthiest and most influential gathered. He thrived on the luxury of his lifestyle: dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, designer suits tailored to perfection, and vacations in private villas that overlooked turquoise waters. For years, Michael operated with one golden rule: win at all costs. He made deals that benefited him alone, crushed competitors without remorse, and saw charity as nothing more than a tax write-off. The poor, in his mind, were simply people who hadn't tried hard enough. He had worked for everything he had. Why couldn't they? That mentality had shielded him from guilt, allowed him to brush past beggars and struggling artists without a second thought. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an audit. An overlooked financial discrepancy turned into a full-blown investigation. Soon, whispers of fraud and embezzlement spread like wildfire, and within days, investors began pulling their money. Michael tried to assure them, tried to spin the narrative in his favor, but confidence in his empire crumbled faster than he could salvage it. Then came the lawsuits. Former business partners, employees, even clients, one by one they turned on him, filing claims of unethical practices, hidden debts, and mismanaged funds. His once loyal attorneys distanced themselves, unwilling to sink with a drowning ship. His assets were frozen, his accounts bled dry by legal fees, and within months, the towering empire he had spent decades building collapsed into nothing more than a scandal-ridden headline. The final blow came in the form of an eviction notice. The penthouse he had called home, where he had once hosted extravagant parties and gazed down at the city from his floor-to-ceiling windows, was no longer his. Security escorted him out, his tailored suit now wrinkled, his designer watch meaningless without the wealth it represented. Michael Thornton, the man who had once looked down on the less fortunate, now found himself standing on the very streets he used to ignore, homeless, alone, forgotten. The city that had once felt like his kingdom now felt like a prison. The same streets Michael used to drive through in his luxury. Cars were now his only home. The towering skyscrapers that once symbolized his success now loomed over him like silent reminders of his downfall. He wandered aimlessly, shoulders hunched, his once polished shoes scuffed and caked in grime. The expensive suit he had been wearing on the day of his eviction had quickly become a burden, stiff and out of place among the homeless men who huddled in alleyways for warmth. Hunger gnawed at him like an old enemy, relentless and unforgiving. He had never known true starvation before. His life had been one of excess, of meals served on silver platters without a second thought. Now he scavenged for leftovers, waiting outside restaurants in the hope that someone might leave behind an unfinished meal. The first time he tried asking for help, he was met with the same dismissive looks he had once given to people like Daniel. "Sorry, I don't carry cash. Get a job. Not my problem." Each rejection was a stab to his pride. Each indifferent stare a reminder of how easily society turned its back on those who had nothing to offer. The same world that had once celebrated him now treated him as invisible. And the worst part? He understood now. He had been that person. He had been the man who looked away, who muttered dismissive words, who kept walking without a second thought. Now it was happening to him. One evening, exhausted and barely able to stand, Michael collapsed onto a park bench. His breath came out in weak, visible puffs in the cold air. He had reached his limit. His fingers trembled from both hunger and the biting chill, his body too weak to even shiver properly. As he sat there, staring at the distant city lights, he realized for the first time in his life, he was truly alone. Then a voice cut through the silence. "You look like you could use a warm meal." Michael turned his head slowly, expecting to see yet another stranger who would soon walk away. But the man standing before him wasn't just anyone. He was well-dressed, carrying a takeout bag in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. His posture was strong, his expression kind, but there was something else. Something familiar. Michael squinted, trying to place the face. The dark eyes, the confident stance, the neatly trimmed beard. And then, like a gut punch, recognition hit him. It was Daniel. The same man he had dismissed all those years ago, the struggling artist he had insulted, the man he had ignored as if he were nothing. Yet here he was, offering Michael exactly what he had once denied him, a chance. Michael's mind raced, but his body was too weak to react. He blinked up at the man standing before him, trying to process the sheer impossibility of the moment. Could it really be him, the struggling artist he had so cruelly dismissed all those years ago? The man whose work he had called garbage without a second thought? And yet here Daniel was, successful, well-dressed, offering a meal to the very person who had once looked down on him. For a moment, pride clawed at Michael's throat, telling him to refuse the food, to pretend he didn't need it. But hunger overruled his ego. With shaky hands, he reached out and accepted the warm takeout box and the coffee, its steam curling into the night air. The first sip burned his throat, but he didn't care. It was the first real warmth he had felt in weeks. They sat in silence for a while, Daniel taking the spot beside him on the bench, as if they were old friends, rather than two men whose lives had once intersected in the cruelest way. Michael avoided looking at him, unsure if he could bear the weight of recognition in Daniel's eyes. But then Daniel spoke. "Do you remember me?" Michael swallowed hard. He didn't want to answer. He could lie, pretend he didn't recognize him, but what was the point? He had nothing left. Not his wealth, not his dignity, not even a roof over his head. He finally turned to face Daniel, his gaze filled with both shame and curiosity. I think so," Michael admitted, his voice hoarse from weeks of hardship. "You were," he hesitated, almost unable to say the words, "an artist. You tried to sell me a painting." Daniel nodded, a small, knowing smile playing at his lips. "And you told me it was garbage." Michael flinched. The memory hit him like a slap. In that moment, he wasn't just remembering the words he had said, he was feeling them. The arrogance in his tone, the disgust in his voice, the way he had dismissed Daniel as if he were nothing more than an insect on the sidewalk. But Daniel wasn't angry. There was no bitterness in his voice, no resentment in his eyes. That was what shook Michael the most. "How did you—" Michael gestured vaguely at Daniel's expensive coat, the confidence in his posture, the sheer success radiating from him. The last time he had seen this man, he had been desperate, struggling just to be noticed. Now he looked like someone who belonged to the world Michael had lost. Daniel chuckled, leaning back against the bench. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" Michael's hands tightened around the coffee cup, as if holding on to something solid could help him process the reality of his situation. He had spent years believing in power, in control, in the idea that only the strongest survived. And yet, here he was, completely powerless, at the mercy of the very man he had once ignored. And for the first time in his life, Michael understood just how unpredictable fate could be. Michael could barely wrap his mind around it. The last time he had seen Daniel, he had been nothing more than a struggling artist on the streets, clutching a canvas like a lifeline. And now he was the one offering a helping hand while Michael sat in the exact same position, hungry, desperate, invisible to the world. The disbelief must have been plain on his face because Daniel chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "You probably want to know how this happened," he said, glancing out at the city lights as if looking back into his past. Michael nodded slowly. Words felt useless, but his eyes begged for an explanation. Daniel took a deep breath. "That day, when you turned me down, I nearly gave up," he admitted. "I had been out there for weeks trying to sell my work, hoping that someone, anyone, would see something in it. But people just kept walking by like I didn't exist. And then you—" He let out a small, dry laugh. "You didn't just ignore me. You made me feel worthless. Like my art had no value. Like I had no value." Michael dropped his gaze, guilt twisting in his stomach. He had never given a second thought to his words before. But now, hearing them echoed back to him, he felt their weight for the first time. "But here's the funny part," Daniel continued, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "The very next day, a woman stopped. She saw my painting, the same one you refused to look at, and she bought it. She didn't just pay for it. She loved it. She asked me about my work, about my story, and it turned out—" He paused, letting the suspense hang in the air. Michael leaned forward slightly, drawn in despite himself. "She was an art curator," Daniel revealed with a grin. "She worked for a gallery downtown. She invited me to showcase some of my pieces at an exhibition." Michael's mouth went dry. He had spent his life believing that luck belonged only to the powerful, to those who made their own fate. But here was proof that sometimes all it took was one moment, one person willing to take a chance, to change everything. "That exhibition led to another," Daniel continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "And another. Soon collectors started noticing my work. People who had never given me the time of day were suddenly offering me commissions. Within 2 years, I had my own gallery." Michael exhaled sharply. 2 years. That was all it had taken for Daniel to go. From being ignored on the streets to running a successful business. Meanwhile, it had taken Michael just a few months to lose everything he had spent decades building. Life was cruel and ironic. Daniel studied him for a moment as if weighing his next words carefully. Then he leaned in slightly. "And now," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you're the one in need." Michael swallowed hard. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't gloating. It was just the truth. For the first time since his fall from grace, Michael truly felt the depth of his situation. He wasn't a powerful businessman anymore. He wasn't feared, respected, or envied. He was just a man who had lost everything, sitting across from someone who had every right to ignore him, but didn't. And that realization was more humbling than anything else. Michael sat in stunned silence, the weight of Daniel's words pressing down on him, like an unbearable truth he couldn't escape. He had once been the man who walked past beggars without a second glance. He had dismissed Daniel with nothing but cruelty. And now fate had flipped the script. He was the one desperate for a break. And Daniel was in the position to either turn his back or extend a hand. Michael braced himself for humiliation. He had seen enough in life to know how the world worked. People didn't just forgive and forget. If the roles had been reversed, Would he have helped Daniel? Would he have looked past the past? Probably not. He had spent his whole life believing that success was a game of survival, that only the strong rose to the top while the weak were left behind. Now he was one of the weak, and in his mind, this was the moment Daniel would make him pay. But instead of gloating, instead of making him beg, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, clean business card. Without a word, he placed it in Michael's trembling hand. Michael hesitated before looking down at it. The embossed letters were elegant, professional. Daniel Carter, Fine Arts Studio. Beneath it was an address in a part of town Michael once frequented for high-end business meetings. It wasn't just a hobby or a side hustle. Daniel had built a legitimate, thriving business. "I know what it's like to struggle," Daniel said simply. "I know what it's like to feel invisible. To have people look right through you like you don't exist," he sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "And I know what it's like to be given a second chance." Michael's grip tightened around the card. He could barely lift his head, ashamed to even meet Daniel's eyes. "Why?" he croaked, voice raw from weeks of hunger and defeat. "Why would you help me after what I did to you?" Daniel studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it either." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. He had built his entire fortune by believing in transactions, not generosity. Everything in his life had been about deals, power, leverage. But Daniel was different. He wasn't offering help because of obligation, pity, or revenge. He was offering it because he believed in something Michael had never valued before: compassion. Michael swallowed hard, pride warring with desperation. The old version of himself, the one who had dismissed, Daniel, without a second thought, would have refused. Would have held on to arrogance even while starving. But that man was gone. He finally exhaled and nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come." Daniel didn't smile, didn't pat him on the back, didn't make it a grand moment. He just gave a simple nod. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., don't be late." Michael watched as Daniel stood up, adjusted his coat and walked away, disappearing into the night. For the first time in months, hope flickered inside Michael's chest. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. The next morning, Michael woke up on the same park bench where Daniel had left him. His body ached from the cold. His stomach gnawed at itself with hunger, and the same tattered suit hung from his frail frame. But in his pocket, clutched tightly in his trembling fingers, was Daniel's business card, a small, rectangular lifeline in a sea of despair. For a long moment, he debated whether to go. What if this was all a mistake? What if Daniel had only made the offer out of pity and would regret it the moment? Michael stepped through the door. His pride still whispered that it would be easier to fade away, to disappear into the streets, rather than risk facing someone who had every right to reject him. But then another thought crept in. What if this was his last chance? With shaky determination, he pushed himself up from the bench and started walking. The city felt different today. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly, looking for scraps or shelter. He had a destination, a purpose, however small. The morning air was crisp, and as he trudged through familiar streets, passing high-end shops and restaurants he once frequented, he was painfully aware of how far he had fallen. The people around him walked past without a glance, just as he had once done to others. When he finally arrived at the address on the card, he hesitated at the door. It was a sleek, modern building, a stark contrast to the crumbling world he had been living in. Through the glass windows, he saw a bustling studio filled with large, colorful paintings, the scent of fresh paint and polished wood filling the air. Several young artists worked at easels, completely engrossed in their craft. And then he saw Daniel. He was standing near the back of the studio, engaged in conversation with a group of clients, gesturing towards a massive abstract piece that hung proudly on the wall. He looked confident, in control, every bit the successful businessman Michael had once been. For a moment, self-doubt hit Michael like a brick wall. What was he doing here? He didn't belong in a place like this. This was a place for creativity, for people with vision and talent. He was just a washed-up businessman who had lost everything. But before he could turn around and flee, Daniel's eyes met his through the glass. There was no shock on his face, no hesitation, just recognition, followed by a simple nod, as if he had been expecting him. Michael took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Daniel excused himself from his clients and walked over, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet Michael with pity or fanfare. Instead, he simply said, "You're on time." Michael swallowed, nodding. Yeah, I came." Daniel studied him for a moment, then held out a hand. "Then let's get started." Michael stared at the outstretched hand, knowing that this wasn't just a handshake. It was an invitation, a chance, a door he had never expected to open. And this time, instead of ignoring it, he reached out and took it. Michael's first days at the studio were harder than he expected. Not physically, but emotionally. He had gone from being a man who commanded boardrooms, who made million-dollar deals with a single phone call, to sweeping floors and running errands in a world he barely understood. The transition was humiliating at first. His first task? Cleaning paintbrushes. Michael had never held a paintbrush in his life, let alone washed one. He stood awkwardly at the sink, scrubbing away at the vibrant smears of color, watching as the water ran blue, then red, then gold. It felt insignificant, pointless. But when he glanced around the studio, no one was laughing at him. No one mocked his downfall. Instead, they worked focused, dedicated, completely immersed in their art. The artists were unlike anyone he had ever worked with in the corporate world. They didn't chase power or status. They didn't care about luxury watches or high-rise apartments. They cared about expression, meaning, and passion. And despite himself, Michael found himself drawn in by their world. At first, he kept his head down, doing whatever small tasks Daniel assigned him. Organizing canvases, making coffee, arranging supplies, each job a far cry from the billion-dollar decisions he had once made. But over time, something strange happened. He started to listen. He started to learn. During lunch breaks, he sat quietly as the artists discussed their inspirations, their struggles, their creative processes. He watched as Daniel mentored young painters, offering guidance not just on technique, but on perseverance, on pushing through rejection and self-doubt. The way Daniel led was nothing like the way Michael had once run his empire. There were no power plays, no intimidation, no crushing competition, just growth, encouragement, a belief in the people around him. And little by little, Michael felt something inside him begin to shift. One afternoon, as he was restocking canvases, he found himself pausing in front of an unfinished painting, a beautiful yet haunting mix of colors that seemed to tell a story he couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, he reached out, trailing his fingers over the dried paint. "You see something in it?" Daniel's voice came from behind him. Michael startled, embarrassed to have been caught. He cleared his throat. I don't know," he admitted. "It's just interesting." Daniel smiled. "That's how it starts." Michael didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. But as the weeks passed, he realized that the art world wasn't just about paintings and galleries, it was about perspective. And his was finally starting to change. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's understanding of success began to unravel, and with it, his old self. He had spent decades believing in a ruthless, cutthroat world where only the strongest survived. But here, in Daniel's studio, he was learning something entirely different. Success wasn't just about climbing higher, it was about lifting others up. One evening, long after the other artists had gone home, Michael found himself alone in the studio with Daniel. The walls were covered in stunning artwork, pieces filled with raw emotion, with stories painted into every brushstroke. Michael had never paid attention to art before. To him, it had always been a luxury, something rich people bought to impress their friends. But now, standing among these canvases, he saw them differently. They weren't just decorations. They were voices, dreams, pieces of the soul. Daniel was at his workbench, adding the final touches to a new painting. Michael hesitated before speaking. "I used to think success was about power," he admitted. His voice was quiet, as if confessing a deep secret. "About winning. About being the one on top." Daniel didn't look up, but a small smile played at his lips. And now, Michael let out a slow breath, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Now I'm starting to think I had it all wrong." He turned to face Daniel fully. "You didn't have to help me. I treated you like nothing. You could have walked away just like I did to you." Daniel finally put his brush down and met Michael's gaze. There was no resentment in his eyes, no smugness, just quiet understanding. "I could have," he admitted. But what would that have done? Made me feel better for a moment? Maybe. But in the end, it wouldn't have changed anything. Not for me. Not for you. Michael swallowed, the weight of those words sinking in. In his old life, he had been taught that helping others was a weakness. That kindness was a luxury only fools indulged in. But Daniel had built an entire life. A successful, meaningful life on the very thing Michael had once dismissed. And it had made him stronger, not weaker. I guess I don't understand why, Michael said, shaking his head. Why give someone like me another chance? Daniel leaned back, studying him for a moment before answering. Because someone gave me one. Michael felt his chest tighten. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about business. It was about people. He had spent his life focused on numbers, on wealth, on power. And where had that gotten him? Alone, homeless, forgotten. But here in this small sunlit studio, surrounded by people who created instead of destroyed, he was starting to realize that real success wasn't about what you had. It was about what you gave. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to be the kind of person who gave back. Months passed, and Michael's transformation was no longer just internal, it was visible. His once weary posture had straightened. His clothes, though simple, were no longer the ragged remains of his past life. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, then with hopelessness, now carried something else entirely: purpose. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was someone trying to build again. Not for power, not for wealth, but for something greater. One evening, Daniel invited him to attend an exclusive art gala. It was being held in one of the high-end venues Michael had once frequented as a wealthy businessman. He felt a pang of discomfort as he stepped inside, surrounded once again by the world he had lost. The expensive suits, the murmured conversations about investments and prestige, it all felt foreign to him now. But this time, he wasn't there as a high-rolling CEO. He wasn't there to impress or to dominate. He was there as Daniel's right hand, helping run the business side of his growing art empire. As he made his way through the gallery, he noticed the familiar gaze of an old business acquaintance, a man he had once closed a massive real estate deal with years ago. The man squinted, clearly trying to place him. He recognized Michael, but something didn't make sense. Michael? The man finally approached, eyes scanning him with curiosity. Is that you? Michael smiled, an easy, confident expression that carried no trace of the cold arrogance he had once worn like armor. Yeah, it's me. The man let out a disbelieving chuckle. Wow, last I heard you... He hesitated, unsure whether to bring up the scandal, the downfall, the loss of everything. Michael saved him the trouble. Yeah, he said simply. I lost it all. He gestured around the room where Daniel's paintings lined the walls, drawing admiration from collectors and art lovers alike. But I found something better. The man frowned slightly. Wait, so what do you do now? Michael met his gaze without hesitation. I help run this gallery. I work with artists, help them grow, help them share their talent with the world. His smile deepened. I help people. The man stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to make sense of the person standing before him. This wasn't the Michael Thornton he had once known. That man had been ruthless, obsessed with power, incapable of seeing value in anything that didn't serve him. This man was different. The businessman nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Well, good for you. Michael shook it, feeling no need to prove anything anymore. He had nothing to prove. As the evening went on, he stood beside Daniel, watching as people admired his work. He saw the joy in Daniel's eyes, the pride of someone who had built something meaningful, not just for himself, but for others. Michael exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle over him. He had spent so much of his life chasing money, believing it was the only thing that defined success. But standing here now, surrounded by passion, by creativity, by purpose, he realized something he had never understood before. Wealth wasn't about numbers in a bank account. It was about impact, about how you treated people, about what you gave to the world. And for the first time in his life, Michael felt truly rich. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons. Michael thought he had it all, but it took losing everything to find what truly mattered. And Daniel? He chose kindness over revenge, proving that the real power isn't in wealth, but in the ability to change someone's life for the better. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories that prove life is full of unexpected twists.